The wind hit Alena's voice like a wall of ice, so strong it knocked the breath out of her lungs before she could even scream. 1 second she was walking along the ridge with her flashlight cutting through the falling snow, and the next second the whole mountain seemed to disappear into white. She could not see her own hands in front of her face. She could not hear anything except the roar of the storm swallowing the world whole. She had been searching for 2 missing hikers, Derek and Owen, who had gone up Mount Ashgrave 3 hours before the weather turned. Now she was the one who might not make it down. Alena dropped to her knees and pressed herself against a boulder, trying to remember everything she had been trained to do. Stay calm. Find shelter. Do not panic. But her fingers were already going numb inside her gloves, and the wind was screaming louder with every passing minute, like it was alive and angry and haunting her. She crawled along the base of the ridge, one hand on the rock, searching for any kind of gap where she could wait out the worst of it. That was when her hand hit something that was not stone. It was soft. Warm even through her glove. And it was huge. Alena froze. For one terrible second she thought she had found a body. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she brushed away the snow with shaking hands, and slowly, an outline began to appear beneath the white fur. Grey fur, streaked with darker patches, matted with ice. A shape far too large to belong to any wolf she had ever heard of, curled tightly against the rock as if it had tried to protect itself from the storm and lost. It was not moving. Every instinct in her body told her to get away. A creature this size could kill her in seconds if it woke up angry, if it woke up at all. But something about the stillness of it, the way its enormous chest was not rising and falling, made her stomach twist with a fear that had nothing to do with her own safety. She should have left it. She would tell herself that 100 times over the following days, and every time, she would remember that she had not even considered it. Alena tore off her gloves so she could feel exactly where the ice had built up, and began to dig with her bare hands. The cold burned instantly, worse than fire, but she kept going, clawing snow away from the animal's side, uncovering more and more of its massive body. Its fur was crusted solid in places. Ice had sealed itself around one of its front legs like a cast. Her fingers scraped raw against frozen rock hidden beneath the snow. She did not stop. She dug until her nails cracked and her knuckles bled, until she could no longer tell if the wetness on her hands was snow melting or her own blood freezing against her skin. The wind tore at her jacket, trying to pull her away from the animal, but she planted her knees into the ground and kept clearing snow from around its head, its neck, its shoulders. When she finally uncovered enough of its chest to press her palm against it, she felt the faintest movement. A breath. Slow, shallow, but there. It was alive. Alena nearly cried with relief, though the tears froze against her cheeks before they could even fall. She kept digging, faster now, uncovering the wolf's full body inch by inch, ignoring the pain screaming through her hands and up her arms. The animal was easily twice the size of any wolf that should exist in these mountains, its paws alone the size of dinner plates, its frame built like something out of an old legend rather than anything that belonged in the modern world. She did not have time to wonder about that. She only had time to save it, or to fail. The final section of ice had frozen solid around one of its back legs, trapping it against a jagged piece of rock. Alena worked her fingers underneath the ice, breaking it apart piece by piece, feeling the cold sink so deep into her hands that she stopped feeling anything at all. She pulled at the ice with everything she had left, and finally, with a soft cracking sound, the leg came free. The wolf's eyes opened. Alena went completely still. They were gold. Not the pale yellow of an ordinary wolf's eyes, but a deep, burning gold, like molten metal glowing from somewhere impossibly far away. And they were not looking at her the way an animal looks at a stranger. They were looking at her the way a person looks at someone they have been waiting for. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The storm howled around them, but inside that small space beside the boulder, everything felt strangely still, as if the world itself were holding its breath along with her. Then the wolf let out a low sound, somewhere between a groan and a whimper, and tried to lift its head. Alena reached out instinctively, placing her raw and bleeding hand against its massive skull, the way she might comfort an injured dog, though every rational part of her brain screamed that this was not a dog, this was not anything ordinary at all. The wolf's breathing steadied under her touch. Its enormous body, which had been rigid with cold and pain, seemed to relax slightly, as if it finally understood it was no longer alone in the snow. Alena had no plan beyond this moment. She had no idea how she was supposed to move an animal this size, let alone find shelter for both of them in the middle of a blizzard that showed no signs of slowing down. But she also knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she was not leaving. She stripped off her outer jacket, despite the biting cold instantly attacking her own body, and draped it over the wolf's exposed side, tucking it in as best she could against the wind. It was a small gesture, almost useless against a storm this powerful, but it was the only thing she had to offer. The wolf's gold eyes never left her face. Somewhere in the back of her mind, buried under exhaustion and cold and fear, Alena registered that this moment felt important in a way she could not explain. Not just important because a life had been saved. Important in a deeper way, like something invisible had shifted, like a door somewhere far away had just been unlocked. She had no way of knowing that the animal lying beside her was not simply a wolf. She had no way of knowing that somewhere deep within the mountain, in a hidden place carved into rock and shielded by trees older than memory, a man had just fallen to his knees in the middle of a room full of his own people, gasping as though the air had been ripped from his lungs, clutching at his chest as pain that was not his own tore through him without warning. She had no way of knowing that the connection between a bonded wolf and its master ran so deep that when one suffered, the other suffered too, no matter the distance between them. All Alena knew was that the wolf beside her was breathing, and that its enormous head had begun to lean, ever so slightly, into her bloodied palm. The storm was not finished with them yet. If anything, it seemed to be growing stronger, the wind twisting into a low, constant howl that vibrated through the rock at her back. Alena knew that staying in the open like this, even tucked against the boulder, would not keep either of them alive much longer. The wolf needed real shelter. So did she. She forced herself back onto her feet, her legs shaking from cold and exhaustion, and looked around at the swelling white for any sign of hope. It was the wolf that moved first. With a strained, trembling effort, the great animal pushed itself up onto its front legs, then slowly, painfully, onto all four. It swayed for a moment, clearly weak, but it did not collapse. Instead, it turned its massive head toward a narrow gap between two rock formations further up the ridge, a path Alena would never have noticed on her own in this weather. It looked back at her once, as if waiting. Alena did not understand what was happening, but she understood enough to know that this animal was trying to lead her somewhere. Whether out of gratitude or some instinct she could not name, it seemed determined that she follow. She pressed her hand against its side for support, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the thick fur, and together, one impossibly slow and painful step at a time, they began to move through the blinding snow. The wolf leaned into her more than once, its strength clearly failing, but it never stopped moving forward. Alena's mind should have been screaming with fear. Instead, all she could think about, oddly, was how warm the wolf's fur felt beneath her freezing fingers, and how strange it was that an animal capable of ending her life in an instant kept turning its head to make sure she was still there beside it. The path between the rocks narrowed further, forcing them both to move carefully along a hidden ledge that the storm had almost completely buried. Alena's boots slipped more than once on ice hidden beneath fresh snow, and each time, the wolf shifted its body just enough to steady her, as if it understood exactly how close she was to falling. She had stopped trying to make sense of any of it. There was no version of tonight that made sense. There was only the storm, and the cold, and this enormous, golden-eyed creature that seemed determined to get them both somewhere safe. After what felt like hours, though it could not have been more than 20 minutes, the wind began to ease, the rock walls around them growing taller, blocking the worst of the storm. Alena caught the faintest outline of something ahead through the snow. The structure. Solid, dark, built directly into the side of the mountain, as though it had grown there rather than been constructed. The wolf let out a low sound, almost like relief, and quickened its pace despite its obvious pain. Alena's frozen fingers curled tighter into its fur as they pressed on together, and for the first time since the storm had swallowed her whole, she allowed herself to believe that she might survive the night after all. She had no idea that stepping through the shadow of that hidden structure would change the rest of her life. She had no idea that somewhere inside, a man with storm-colored eyes and a title few outsiders ever learned, was already moving toward the entrance, his heart pounding with a fear he had not felt in years, because the bond in his chest had just told him, without words, that his wolf was no longer alone. It had been found by someone who was never supposed to exist in his world at all. Alena woke to warmth pressing against every part of her body, so different from the last thing she remembered that for a moment she was convinced she had died. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to soft firelight instead of blinding snow, and the first thing she noticed was that her hands, wrapped tightly in clean bandages, no longer felt frozen. They throbbed instead, deep and aching, but they were warm. She was lying on a bed in a room she did not recognize, thick wooden beams overhead, heavy furs draped across her body, a fire crackling somewhere nearby. For a long moment she simply lay there, trying to piece together how she had gone from dying in a blizzard to waking up somewhere that felt, impossibly, safe. Then she remembered the wolf. Alena sat up too quickly, and pain shot through her side, a sharp reminder that her body had been through more than she initially realized. A voice spoke from across the room, low and calm, though there was an edge to it that told her its owner was anything but relaxed. You should not move so fast. You collapsed from the cold. Your body needs time. Alena turned toward the voice and found a man standing near the doorway, watching her with an intensity that made her suddenly very aware of how vulnerable she was. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed simply in dark clothing that did nothing to hide the quiet authority in the way he carried himself. His eyes were a shade of gray so pale they almost looked silver in the firelight, and there was something about them, something achingly familiar, that made Elena's breath catch. Gold eyes. She had seen those eyes before, glowing in the darkness of the storm. You're the wolf, she said before she could stop herself, then immediately felt foolish for saying it out loud. The man's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features before he masked it again. He stepped further into the room, and despite every warning bell going off in Elena's mind telling her that this man radiated more danger than anyone she had ever encountered, she found herself unable to look away. My name is Kellen Ashgrave, he said. And you saved a life last night that no one else on this mountain could have saved. Alena did not understand what he meant, not fully, not yet. She only knew that the wolf's chest had been marked with old scars beneath its fur, faint lines she had felt without truly seeing, and that something about the way Kellen moved reminded her exactly of the way that wolf had leaned into her hand, as if grateful beyond words. Where am I? She asked instead, her voice quieter now. You are in my home, Kellen answered simply. Black Ridge territory. Very few outsiders have ever set foot here, and fewer still have left again to tell anyone about it. The words should have terrified her. Instead, something in his tone told her this was not a threat, merely a fact he felt obligated to share. Alena studied him carefully, taking in the exhaustion behind his eyes, the tension in his shoulders that suggested he had not slept, the way his hands remained loosely clenched at his sides as though he were holding himself back from something. She thought of the wolf's ragged breathing beneath her palms, the way its enormous body had trembled with cold and pain. Is the wolf all right? She asked. For the first time since she had opened her eyes, something in Kellen's controlled expression cracked. A flicker of raw emotion passed over his face, quickly hidden but not quickly enough for Alena to miss it entirely. He will heal, Kellen said, his voice rougher now. Because of you? If you had not found him when you did, if you had simply walked past and left him buried beneath that snow, he would not have survived the night. And neither, in truth, would I. Alena frowned, confusion pulling at her thoughts. I don't understand, she said. He's your wolf. Why would his death affect you like that? Kellen was quiet for a long moment, studying her as though weighing how much truth she could handle, how much of his word she was ready to hear about. Finally, he moved closer, taking a seat in the chair beside her bed, close enough that she could see the faint silver flecks scattered through his pale gray eyes. There are things about this place, about my people, that you are not prepared to understand yet, he said carefully. But I will tell you this much. The wolf you found last night is not simply an animal that belongs to me. He is a part of me. Bonded to me since the day I was born, sharing my pain, my strength, my very life. If he had died in that storm, I would have died with him. Alena stared at him, her mind racing to make sense of what he was describing. It sounded impossible, something from an old story meant to frighten children, yet she had seen those gold eyes herself, had felt the impossible size and strength of that creature beneath her own hands. And more than that, she had felt, in some way she could not explain, that the connection between them had been real. "So I saved your life too," she said slowly. Kellen's jaw tightened. "Yes," he admitted. "Which means you are owed a debt that very few humans have ever been owed by someone in my position. A debt I intend to honor, whether you ask for anything in return or not." Alena shook her head immediately. "I don't want anything," she said. "I did what anyone would have done. I couldn't just leave an injured animal to die in the snow." Something shifted in Kellen's expression at her words, something that looked almost like disbelief mixed with a reluctant kind of respect. "Most people," he said quietly, "would have walked away the moment they realized what they were looking at. Even if they did not understand exactly what he was, most people would have run rather than dig with their bare hands until their fingers bled." Alena glanced down at her bandaged hands, the memory of the pain rushing back now that he mentioned it. "I couldn't just leave him," she repeated simply, because it was the only explanation she had. Kellen studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his pale eyes, before he finally rose from the chair. "You need rest," he said. "And I need to see to matters that cannot wait. But know this. While you remain within Black Ridge territory, you are under my protection. No one here will harm you." Before Alena could respond, he was already moving toward the door, though he paused just before stepping through it, glancing back at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words clearly costing him something to say. "For what you did." Then he was gone, leaving Alena alone with the fire and her racing thoughts, and a growing certainty that whatever world she had stumbled into during that storm, it was far larger and far stranger than anything she had ever imagined existed in these mountains. Over the following hours, as Alena drifted in and out of an exhausted, healing sleep, she became aware of movement outside her room. Voices, low and hushed, carrying just enough for her to catch fragments of conversation through the thick wooden door. She touched him. The great wolf. And lived. A human woman dug him out with her bare hands. Do you understand what that means? The Alpha King has never allowed an outsider this close. Not once in 10 years. Alena lay still, straining to listen, piecing together enough to understand that whatever she had done last night was not simply an act of kindness in the eyes of these people. It was something extraordinary, something that had shifted the careful order of a world she barely understood, and not everyone within that world seemed pleased about the shift. At one point, a new voice joined the hushed conversation outside her door, colder and sharper than the others, carrying an edge of barely restrained anger. "She should not be here at all," the voice said. "Whatever debt is owed can be repaid and settled. She does not belong in Black Ridge, and the longer she stays, the more dangerous this becomes for all of us." Elena's stomach tightened at the venom in those words, though she could not yet put a name or a face to the voice. She had no way of knowing that the man speaking outside her door was Roran, Kellen's second in command, a wolf who had spent a decade guarding Black Ridge's borders and secrets with ruthless dedication, and who saw her presence not as a miracle, but as the first crack in a foundation he had sworn to protect at any cost. For now, all Alena knew was that she had wandered into a hidden world she barely understood, bound by threads of loyalty and suspicion she could not yet see clearly, and that the man with pale grey eyes and impossible strength seemed determined to protect her, even as others around him seemed just as determined to see her gone. She closed her eyes again, exhaustion finally pulling her back under, unaware that outside in the snow-covered courtyard, the great wolf, still healing, had lifted his massive head toward the window of her room, gold eyes fixed unwaveringly on the glass, as though he could sense exactly where she lay, and had no intention of looking away. 3 days passed before Alena was strong enough to walk without her legs shaking beneath her, and in that time, she learned more about Black Ridge than she ever thought she would need to know. The compound was larger than it first appeared, built into the mountain itself, with stone hallways and wooden rooms that somehow felt both ancient and alive. People moved through it constantly, though she quickly noticed they were never simply people. There was something different about the way they carried themselves, quick and controlled, eyes that occasionally flashed gold in the dim light before settling back to their normal color. She had stumbled into a world of wolves who wore human skin. No one explained it to her directly, not at first, but she pieced it together from the whispers, from the careful way everyone watched her, from the moment she saw a young girl in the courtyard shift her hand into something that was not entirely human before catching herself and pulling her sleeve down quickly. Alena said nothing, only nodded slightly as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world, and the girl relaxed instantly, offering her a shy, grateful smile. It was a woman named Ivy, the park's healer, who eventually sat with Alena and explained things plainly, tending to the last of the wounds on her hands while she spoke. "You are not in danger here," Ivy said gently, "unless you make yourself a danger to us. Kellen has claimed you under his protection, and in Black Ridge, that means something. It means everything." "Why?" Alena asked. "I'm just someone who happened to find an injured animal in a storm." Ivy's expression softened into something between amusement and disbelief. "You still don't understand what you did, do you?" she said. "The Great Wolf is not simply Kellen's companion. He is the physical form of Kellen's own spirit, split into two halves the day he was born, one walking on 2 legs and one on 4. It is one of the oldest and rarest bonds among our kind. If the wolf dies, the man dies with him, no matter how far apart they might be standing." Alena absorbed this slowly, remembering the way Kellen had looked at her that first morning, hollow-eyed and exhausted, as though he had nearly lost everything without ever leaving his own home. "So when I found him," she said quietly, "I was already saving both of them." "Exactly," Ivy said. "And that is not something anyone in Black Ridge takes lightly. Least of all Kellen." Alena thought about that for a long while after Ivy left, sitting by the window and watching snow drift lazily past the glass, so much gentler now than the storm that had nearly killed her. She thought about the wolf's gold eyes staring into hers as though it recognized something in her long before she understood anything about him. She thought about Kellen's careful, guarded manner, and the flicker of vulnerability she had seen behind his controlled expression more than once. It was later that same evening that she saw him again, this time outside, standing near the edge of a wooden fence overlooking a steep drop into the valley below. He was alone, his shoulders tense, staring out at the mountains as though searching for an answer to a question only he understood. Alena approached carefully, unsure if she was welcome, but he glanced back at her before she could decide whether to speak, and something in his expression eased slightly at the sight of her. "You should not be out here in the cold," he said, though there was no real command in his voice, only quiet concern. "I wanted some air," Alena replied, coming to stand beside him at a respectful distance. "And I wanted to ask you something." Kellen turned toward her fully now, his pale eyes studying her with an intensity that still made her feel strangely exposed, though not unpleasantly so. "Ask," he said simply. "Why do your people seem so uneasy about me being here?" Alena said. "I've heard the whispers. I know some of them think I shouldn't stay." Kellen's jaw tightened, and for a moment Alena thought he might avoid the question entirely. Instead, he exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the cold air, and answered with more honesty than she expected. "Black Ridge has held its territory for generations without ever needing to rely on anyone outside our own kind," he said. "My people have learned, through painful experience, that trusting humans with our secrets tends to end badly. There have been mistakes in the past. Deaths. Betrayals. It has left scars that have not fully healed, even after all these years. But you brought me here anyway," Alena said. "Because you saved my life," Kellen answered simply, as though that alone explained everything he needed it to. "And because turning you away in that storm would have meant your death as well. Whatever risk your presence brings, I could not allow that to happen." Alena studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of resentment or regret in his words, and found none. Only a quiet, steady conviction that told her his decision, however complicated it made things for him, was not one he doubted. "There's someone who wants me gone though," she said carefully. "I heard him. Outside my door, that first night." Something dark passed behind Kellen's eyes at her words. "Roren," he said, his voice hardening. "My second in command. He has protected this territory alongside me for 10 years, and his loyalty to Black Ridge is absolute. He does not trust easily, and he trusts outsiders even less. His concerns are not entirely without merit, but I will not allow his fear to dictate how I honor a debt I owe. Alena wanted to ask more, but the sound of footsteps crunching through snow interrupted them, and she turned to see a man approaching, tall and broad-shouldered like Kellen, though his expression carried none of the same warmth. His eyes, a sharp amber color, flicked toward Alena with barely concealed suspicion before settling on Kellen. "We need to speak," Lawrence said, his voice clipped. "Alone?" Kellen's expression remained neutral, though Alena noticed the subtle way his shoulders squared slightly, as though preparing for a conversation he had already anticipated and did not particularly welcome. "Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of her," he replied evenly. Lawrence's jaw tightened, but after a brief hesitation, he continued anyway. "Scouts along the eastern border reported movement from Iron Hollow territory," he said. "Their alpha has been asking questions about Black Ridge, about rumors that our king nearly died in the storm 3 nights ago. Word is spreading faster than we anticipated." Kellen's expression darkened. "Because someone within our own walls is talking," he said, his tone sharp enough that Lawrence's jaw clenched. "That is not the point right now," Lawrence said, his gaze flicking pointedly toward Alena. "The point is that the longer this human remains here, visible to anyone who might be watching our borders, the more vulnerable we appear. A wounded king, distracted by an outsider, is exactly the kind of weakness Iron Hollow has been waiting years to exploit." Alena felt her stomach twist uncomfortably at his words, suddenly aware of how much bigger this situation was than she had initially understood. She was not simply a guest recovering from an accident. She was, without ever intending to be, a variable in a conflict that had nothing to do with her. "I don't want to cause problems for anyone," she said quietly. "Once the road's clear, I leave. I have a life waiting for me. A sister who is probably worried sick by now." Lauren's expression did not soften at her words, but something in Kellen's did, a flicker of something unreadable passing behind his pale eyes before he masked it again. "You will leave when it is safe to do so," Kellen said firmly, addressing both her and Lauren at once. "Not before. I will not send her out into another storm simply to ease anyone's concerns about appearances." Lauren's mouth pressed into a thin line, clearly biting back further argument, though his amber eyes lingered on Alena a moment longer, cold and calculating in a way that made her skin prickle uncomfortably. Without another word, he turned and stalked back toward the compound, leaving a heavy silence behind him. "I'm sorry," Alena said after a moment. "I never meant to make things difficult for you." Kellen shook his head slowly. "You saved a life that mattered more than you understand," he said. "The difficulty that follows is not yours to apologize for." They stood together in silence for a while longer, the mountains stretching endlessly around them, the cold air sharp and clean. Alena found herself unexpectedly comfortable in that silence, aware of how strange it was that a man she had known for only a handful of days already felt less like a stranger and more like someone whose presence steadied her rather than frightened her. Over the following days, that strange comfort only grew. Kellen sought her out more often than she expected, walking with her through quiet parts of the compound, answering her questions about park life with a patience that surprised even him, judging by the faint, almost puzzled look he wore each time he realized how easily their conversations flowed. She learned that he had become Alpha far younger than most, after his father's sudden death, forced to hold together a fractured pack while grieving and learning leadership at once. She learned that the weight of that responsibility rarely left his shoulders, even during quiet moments that should have felt like rest. In turn, she found herself sharing pieces of her own life she had not spoken of in years. Her sister, who worried constantly since their parents passed. Her work, which she loved despite its dangers, because saving people, even strangers, felt like the only thing that made sense of a world that so often felt senseless. Kellen listened to all of it with a quiet intensity that made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely seen. The great wolf healed steadily during this time as well, and more than once Alena visited him in the courtyard where he rested, his golden eyes brightening whenever she approached, his enormous head nudging gently against her hand as though he remembered exactly what she had done for him. There was something deeply moving about the way he responded to her, a recognition that went beyond simple gratitude, though Alena could not yet fully understand what it meant. It was Ivy, once again, who offered a hint she was not entirely prepared for. "He does not respond to just anyone that way," Ivy said one afternoon, watching the wolf lean contentedly into Elena's touch. Not even to most of our own kind. There is something between the two of you that goes beyond what happened in the storm. Something Kellen has likely noticed as well, whether he has said so or not. Alena did not ask her to elaborate, though the words stayed with her long after Ivy walked away. As the days passed, the roads leading down the mountain slowly began to clear, weather reports from the small radio in the compound's main hall confirming that the worst of the storm system had finally moved on. Alena knew what that meant. It meant her time in Black Ridge, however strange and unexpectedly meaningful it had become, was coming to an end. She found Kellen later that evening in the same spot by the wooden fence where they had first spoken honestly with one another, staring out at the darkening valley below. "The roads are clear," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. Kellen did not look at her immediately, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "I am aware," he said. "I should go home soon," Alena continued. "My sister needs to know I'm alive. And I have a job waiting for me, people who are probably wondering where I disappeared to." Finally, Kellen turned to face her, and the look in his pale eyes carried a weight she had not seen from him before, something that looked dangerously close to reluctance. "I know," he said quietly. "I have known since the moment the storm broke that this day would come." Neither of them said anything further for a long moment, the silence between them heavier now, filled with things neither seemed entirely ready to voice. "I'll arrange for someone to escort you down the mountain in the morning," Kellen finally said. "The weather has cleared, but the pass can still be unpredictable this time of year. I want you to be safe." Alena nodded, though something in her chest tightened uncomfortably at the thought of leaving, a feeling she was not entirely prepared to examine too closely. That night, as she packed the few belongings that had been provided to her, a new weather alert crackled quietly over the compound's radio system, easily missed by anyone not listening carefully. A warning had been issued for the lower pass, cautioning of unstable snowpack following the recent storm, a risk that officials described, almost in passing, as moderate. Alena did not hear it. Neither did anyone else paying close enough attention that night to think much of it at all. Morning arrived pale and clear, the kind of bright, deceptive sunlight that made a mountain look calm even when it was anything but. Alena stood at the edge of the compound with her bag slung over one shoulder, watching her breath curl into the cold air, trying to ignore the strange heaviness sitting in her chest at the thought of leaving. Kellen was waiting near the gate, dressed for travel himself, and the moment she saw him standing there, she understood he intended to escort her personally rather than send someone else in his place. "You didn't have to come yourself," she said as she approached. "I know," he answered simply, offering no further explanation, as though the matter had never truly been in question. Beside him stood the great wolf, fully healed now, his massive frame moving with the same fluid strength she remembered from before the storm had ever touched him. His golden eyes met hers immediately, and Alena felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest at the sight of him standing tall and whole. "He insisted on joining us as well," Kellen said, a faint, reluctant smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It seems he is no more willing to let you go alone than I am." Alena reached out and rested her hand against the wolf's massive head, feeling him lean into her touch exactly the way he had that first night in the storm. Something about the gesture steadied her, even as the weight in her chest grew heavier. They set off down the mountain path shortly after, the three of them moving in careful silence at first, the snow beneath their boots crunching softly in the clear morning air. Roran had not come to see them off, though Alena caught sight of him briefly near the edge of the compound, his amber eyes following their departure with an expression she could not quite read, somewhere between relief and something far less certain. The path down was steeper than Alena remembered, winding along narrow ledges and through dense clusters of pine trees weighed down with fresh snow. Kellen walked close beside her, steadying her more than once when her boots slipped on hidden patches of ice, his hand firm and warm against her arm each time. "You've been quiet," he said eventually, breaking the long silence between them. "Just thinking," Alena admitted. "About how strange it's going to feel, going back to my normal life after all this." Kellen glanced at her, something unreadable passing behind his pale eyes. "Do you regret finding him?" he asked quietly, nodding toward the wolf walking steadily ahead of them. Alena shook her head immediately. "Never," she said. "Not for a second." They continued on in comfortable silence after that, the mountains stretching wide and white around them, the sky above clear and calm in a way that felt almost mocking given what was coming. Alena had no way of knowing that deep within the snowpack above them, weeks of accumulated pressure had already begun shifting, weakened further by the previous storm, waiting only for the smallest disturbance to break loose entirely. They were perhaps halfway down the pass when Alena first heard it. A low sound, deep and distant, like distant thunder rolling across the mountain, except the sky above remained perfectly clear. Kellen's entire body went rigid beside her, his head snapping upward toward the ridge high above them, his expression shifting instantly from calm to something sharp and alert. "Move," he said, his voice suddenly hard and urgent. "Now." Alena did not have time to ask why. The sound grew louder, closer, and this time she felt it too, a deep vibration traveling up through the ground beneath her boots, powerful enough to rattle her teeth. The great wolf let out a sharp, warning howl, already turning to push against her side, trying to guide her off the main path toward a cluster of thick trees. Kellen grabbed her arm, half pulling her forward, his eyes scanning the ridge above with the kind of focused urgency that told her, more clearly than words could, exactly how much danger they were suddenly in. The white wall of snow appeared at the top of the ridge like something out of a nightmare, tumbling downward with terrifying speed, gathering more snow and force with every second, a roaring, churning mass that swallowed everything in its path. Elena's legs moved before her mind fully caught up with what was happening, sprinting alongside Kellen toward the trees, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The roar behind them grew deafening, the ground shaking harder now, snow and ice spraying into the air as the avalanche closed the distance between them at an impossible speed. They were not going to make it to the trees in time. Kellen shouted something she could not fully hear over the roar, shoving her heart to one side just as the leading edge of the avalanche reached them. Alena felt herself thrown off her feet, the world dissolving into a chaotic blur of white and force and sound, tumbling violently as the snow swallowed her whole. She had no sense of up or down, no sense of anything except the crushing weight pressing in from every direction, the roar fading into a strange, muffled silence as the avalanche finally slowed and settled, burying her completely beneath layers of snow and ice. For a moment, everything was still. Elena's lungs burned, desperate for air, but the pressure surrounding her body made it impossible to move even an inch. Darkness pressed in from every side, cold seeping through her clothing with terrifying speed, and for the first time since the storm had first swallowed her days earlier, true panic threatened to overwhelm her entirely. She forced herself to stay calm, remembering every scrap of training she had ever received about surviving beneath snow. Do not waste air. Do not panic. Try to create even the smallest pocket of space to breathe. She had no way of knowing whether Kellen had survived the same crushing wave of snow, whether the wolf had been thrown clear or buried alongside her, whether anyone even knew where to begin searching for them at all. Above the snow, several hundred feet up the slope where the force of the avalanche had thrown him clear, Kellen struggled up out of the snow, his body bruised and aching, his mind screaming with a fear far worse than any physical pain. The great wolf lay nearby, dazed but alive, already scrambling upright and shaking snow from his thick fur. "Alena," Kellen called out, his voice raw and desperate, scanning the vast, freshly settled expanse of snow that now covered the entire pass below them. There was no answer. No sign of her at all. The fear that gripped him in that moment was unlike anything he had ever experienced, sharper and more consuming than even the pain he had felt the night his wolf lay dying in the storm. He had faced down rival alphas without hesitation, had led his pack through years of hardship and conflict without ever once feeling this particular kind of helpless terror clawing at his chest. He began digging immediately, his hands staring into the snow with a desperation that mirrored, in a strange and painful way, the exact same desperation Alena had shown when she first found his wolf buried beneath the storm. The wolf joined him instantly, massive paws throwing snow aside with powerful, controlled bursts, both of them working in frantic, wordless coordination. Kellen, the wolf's voice echoed inside his mind, their bond allowing communication no outsider could ever witness. "We have to call the others. This area is too large for the two of us alone." Kellen did not stop digging even as he reached out through the pack bond, sending an urgent call that reached every member of Black Ridge within moments, summoning every able body toward the pass. Within minutes, others began arriving, some in human form, others already shifted, all of them tearing into the snow with desperate urgency once they understood who was buried beneath it. Even Roran arrived, his expression tight and unreadable, but he said nothing about his previous objections, immediately joining the frantic effort to search the vast field of snow. Time became meaningless as the search stretched on, the cold air filled with shouted instructions and the constant sound of snow being thrown aside, hours blurring together as hope began, slowly and painfully, to waver among those searching. Beneath the snow, Alena fought to stay conscious, her body growing weaker with every passing minute, the small pocket of air she had managed to create shrinking further as exhaustion pulled at her. She thought of her sister, waiting for news that might never come. She thought of the mountain rescue work she loved, the strange irony of becoming the one who needed rescuing after saving so many others herself. And she thought of Kellen, and the wolf, and the strange, impossible warmth she had felt in Black Ridge despite everything dangerous surrounding it, and found herself hoping, more than anything else, that she would have the chance to see them both again. Above her, buried deep enough that sound barely reached her at all, she thought she heard something. A voice, calling her name, faint and desperate, carried down through layers of snow and ice. She tried to call back, but her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, swallowed instantly by the crushing silence around her. The cold was growing harder to fight now, a dangerous drowsiness creeping in at the edges of her mind, urging her to simply close her eyes and rest. She recognized the danger in that feeling immediately, forcing herself to move whatever small part of her body she still could, refusing to let the cold claim her without a fight. Somewhere above her, Kellen's desperate search continued without pause, his hands raw and bleeding despite his enhanced strength, refusing every suggestion from his pack that he stop and rest even for a moment. The bond between them, though newly formed and not yet fully understood by either of them, pulled at him with an intensity that felt disturbingly similar to the bond he shared with his own wolf. He would not stop. Not until he found her. Not while there was still even the smallest chance she remained alive beneath the snow that had swallowed her so completely. Hours passed on the mountain, the sun sliding lower behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the vast field of disturbed snow where dozens of Black Ridge members continued their desperate search. Kellen had long since stopped feeling the cold in his hands, his fingers numb and torn, his mind fixed entirely on the faint, weakening pull he felt through the bond that had somehow already formed between himself and the woman buried somewhere beneath the snow. Roran walked beside him now without complaint, his earlier objections seemingly forgotten in the face of the crisis unfolding around them. Every member of the pack understood, without needing to be told, exactly how much this search mattered, not simply because of the death owed, but because of what Kellen had become over these past days, a man who no longer moved through his responsibilities alone. "We are running out of daylight," one of the searchers called out cautiously, though no one dared suggest stopping outright. Kellen ignored the comment entirely, moving instead toward a section of snow near a cluster of broken tree branches, something tugging at his instincts that he could not fully explain. The great wolf, moving alongside him, suddenly went rigid, his nose pressed low against the snow, a low, urgent sound rumbling from deep in his chest. "Here," Kellen said sharply, dropping to his knees immediately. "Dig here." The others converged instantly, snow flying in every direction as dozens of hands worked together with renewed urgency. Kellen tore into the snow with everything he had left, ignoring the pain screaming through his raw, frozen fingers, refusing to slow down even as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm his own body. Finally, his hand broke through into open space. His heart nearly stopped as his fingers brushed against fabric, then skin, cold but unmistakably real. "Alena," he shouted, his voice cracking with a desperation he made no attempt to hide. "Alena, can you hear me?" For a terrifying moment, there was no response at all. Then, faint and barely audible, a soft groan reached his ears, and relief crashed through him so powerfully that his hands shook even harder than before. They walked quickly now, clearing away the remaining snow with careful urgency, until finally Alena's pale, half-conscious face emerged from the darkness that had surrounded her for hours. Her lips had turned a dangerous shade of blue, her body trembling weakly, but her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then slowly finding Kellen's face above her. "You found me," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "I told you I would not stop looking," Kellen said, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer bothered to hide from anyone watching. They lifted her carefully from the snow, wrapping her immediately in thick furs brought by the others, and Kellen carried her himself the entire way back to the compound, refusing to let anyone else take that responsibility even for a moment. The great wolf walked pressed close against his side the whole way, his golden eyes occasionally flicking toward Elena with a warmth that mirrored exactly what Kellen himself felt but had not yet found the words to express. Elena drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey back, snippets of warmth and voices reaching her through the fog of exhaustion and cold. She remembered Kellen's arms holding her steady, his voice murmuring quiet reassurances she could not fully process, the steady, comforting presence of the wolf never straying far from her side. By the time they reached Black Ridge, Ivy was already waiting, moving quickly to begin treating Elena's injuries the moment Kellen laid her down. The next several hours passed in a blur of warm blankets, gentle hands, and the slow, gradual return of feeling to her frozen limbs, pain replacing numbness in a way that, strangely, felt like relief rather than suffering. When Elena finally woke fully, hours later, the fire in her room burned low and steady, and Kellen sat beside her bed exactly where she remembered him sitting that very first morning after the storm, though something about his expression now felt entirely different. Softer. More open. As though whatever careful walls he usually kept firmly in place had finally been allowed to fall. "You stayed," she said quietly, her voice still rough but steadier than before. "I never left," Kellen answered simply. Elena studied his face for a long moment, taking in the exhaustion etched into his features, the raw, bandaged state of his hands that mirrored, almost exactly, the state her own hands had been in the very first night they met. "Why does this keep happening to us?" she asked softly, a faint, tired smile pulling at her lips despite everything. Digging each other out of the snow. Kellen's mouth curved into the first genuine smile Elena had ever seen from him, something warm and unguarded that transformed his entire face. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "it is because we were always meant to find each other, one way or another." It was Ivy, arriving later that evening to check on Elena's recovery, who finally offered the explanation that had been building quietly beneath the surface of everything that happened since that very first storm. "The bond between wolf and mate is not always immediate," she explained gently, settling into the chair beside Elena's bed. "Sometimes it reveals itself slowly, through moments of crisis, through acts that prove a connection deeper than either person initially realizes. The great wolf recognized you the very night you found him buried in the snow. He recognized you as Kellen's true mate long before either of you understood what that meant." Elena's breath caught, memories flooding back of the wolf's golden eyes staring into hers that very first night, recognition burning in their depths in a way she had not been able to explain at the time. "That's why he trusted me immediately," she said slowly. "Why he led me back here instead of simply waiting for someone else to find him." "Exactly," Ivy said, smiling warmly. "And it is why Kellen very nearly lost his mind searching for you today. The bond does not lie, even when the two people carrying it have not yet found the words for what they feel." Kellen, who had remained quiet throughout this explanation, finally spoke, his pale eyes fixed steadily on Elena's face. "I did not understand it myself until today," he admitted quietly. "Until the moment I thought I might lose you, and realized the pain of that possibility went far deeper than simple gratitude or duty ever could." Elena reached out, taking his bandaged hand gently in her own, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers exactly as she had felt it that very first night in the storm, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly. "Not unless you're standing beside me." News of what had happened spread quickly through Black Ridge over the following days, and Elena noticed a shift in the way the pack regarded her, suspicion melting steadily into genuine acceptance as word of the true bond between her and Kellen became widely known. Even Roran, who sought her out privately several days later, offered something she had not expected from him. "I judge you unfairly," he said, his tone stiff but sincere. "I saw only the risk an outsider represented. I did not consider that some bonds matter more than the boundaries we build to protect ourselves. I was wrong, and I am sorry for the way I treated you." Elena accepted his apology graciously, understanding, perhaps better than most, exactly how difficult it could be to let go of old fears in the face of something unexpected and new. In the weeks that followed, Elena made the journey back down the mountain, though this time it was simply to gather her belongings and speak with her sister, who wept with relief upon hearing she was safe, though she listened with wide-eyed astonishment to the version of events Elena felt comfortable sharing. Elena promised to visit often, and meant it fully, even as she made the choice, without hesitation, to return to Black Ridge, to the mountain, and to the man whose life had become intertwined with hers the very moment she chose to dig through the snow rather than walk away. Kellen met her at the same ridge where their story had first begun, the very spot where she had found his wolf buried beneath the storm, the great wolf himself standing proudly beside him, gold eyes bright and warm in the clear mountain light. "You came back," Kellen said, though there was no real doubt in his voice, only quiet joy. "I told you I would," Alena answered, closing the distance between them. Standing together on that ridge, with the mountains stretching endlessly around them and the wolf pressed warmly against her side, Alena finally understood the strange, powerful pull that had guided her through that very first storm. She had not simply stumbled into a hidden world of wolves and ancient bonds. She had found the place, and the people, and the man she was always meant to belong to. No longer an outsider carried in by a storm, Alena Voss took her place beside Kellen Ashgrave as something far greater than a guest within Black Ridge territory. She became its queen, chosen not by blood or by duty, but by a bond forged in ice and snow, tested by fire and fear, and proven unbreakable by the very avalanche that had once threatened to take everything away. And on quiet evenings, when the mountain wind grew soft and gentle rather than fierce, Alena would often find herself back at that same ridge, the great wolf resting peacefully beside her, Kellen's hand warm in hers, grateful beyond words for a storm that had once seemed like the worst night of her life, but had, in truth, given her everything that mattered most.